Hi, John Paul.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. Good to be with you.
Good to have you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are John Paul Lederach, and you are, if Wikipedia is correct, I think you still have an affiliation with Notre Dame, right? Where you are
Correct, yes.
Professor of International Peace Building.
Yeah, and senior advisor at Humanity United.
Where you are at the moment, their headquarters in San Francisco.
That's correct.
Now it is Christmas time, so I actually want to start out with a little Bible reading, if you don't mind. It's from the nativity story in Luke. Now there were in the same country shepherds living out in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were greatly afraid. Then the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which will be to all people. For there is born to you this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be the sign to you. You will find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes lying in a manger." And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host praising God and saying, this is the payoff, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men." And I think because of this, I've always actually associated that line with Christmas. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men. So I thought it made sense to bring a peacemaker on. That's what you do for a living. You're also a Christian, for that matter. I think you're a Mennonite, right?
That's correct, yes.
And Mennonites are very serious about peace, right?
Absolutely.
Your father was a Mennonite minister, is that right?
Yes, that's true. He was a minister for quite a few years, and then came across to be a professor at a small Mennonite college where my mother also taught.
Okay. And you're quite well known in this field, the peacemaking field. You've written very well-known books. You wrote a book called The Moral Imagination. You also wrote a book whose title, I think, was changed. It was originally Journey Toward Reconciliation, and then was it republished as Reconcile?
Yeah, it was republished about 15 years later under the title of Reconcile. It has some revisions and a couple of new chapters that were added.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay, so I guess I'm hoping to get some encouragement from you, because I've got to say, looking around the world, there have been times when things looked better. There is a lot of conflict, and the conflict that gets the most publicity tends to be in the most volatile parts of the world, and also to be conflicts that has the involvement of great powers. So we're hearing a lot about Syria, and we should be, because it's a totally horrible situation. But meanwhile, I heard on the news this morning about Sudan and South Sudan and a civil war. I had half forgotten about Sudan. Things like this are kind of bubbling up all the time. So I want to start by asking you, you've been at this a long time. You've seen real successes at peacemaking, and you've been part of them, and you document them in your books. But how are you feeling, looking around, honestly? How optimistic or pessimistic are you about the world?
Yeah, well, from the background that I come from, I approach the words optimism and pessimism a bit differently. I would say I retain a great sense of hope, which is different than those two words. What I typically find in a lot of settings where I work, these are settings that have had very long-standing patterns of deep conflict and open violence. So there's a lot of structural injustices, forms of exclusion where people feel that their basic well-being is not taken care of, they're not respected, they have much less dignity than they would want, and they last for a long time. And so when I have this odd phrase, in fact, I even titled one of my chapters, "The Gift of Pessimism." When people are optimistic, I tend to become a bit more pessimistic, because I think we have to keep ourselves as realistic as possible about how hard change is to accomplish when a lot of things have happened that have harmed people for long periods of time. But when people are really pessimistic, I am optimistic, because I think it gives us a basis from which we see better and more clearly the challenges that lay ahead. Mm-hmm. Sudan, South Sudan, for example, that you just mentioned, I think probably you were referring to South Sudan, in that yesterday Ban Ki-moon at the UN, near the end of his term, released a a statement that said the country is on the precipice of a genocide and we need to be cautious and aware. Now, that would be a sign, I think, of pessimism. But at the same time, that same morning, I received a note from several sources in South Sudan around the work of church leaders, the South Sudan Council of Churches, a range of people, including some bishops who had just met and who were saying, basically this message: listen, we know we're in deep trouble. We know that we need to change things. We know that the international efforts are important. But ultimately, we in South Sudan have to find a way to talk with each other and respect each other differently. And it's our responsibility. Now, I take that to say two things. One, the situation is dire. And two, it is significant that people are saying we have responsibilities and we must rise to our greater imagination and capacity to respond to those. Because I think ultimately these conflicts are not handled well from the outside. Those can create temporary spaces and protections, but they have to have a deep rootedness from within the context that addresses these issues that have historic patterns to them in the past. So,
okay, yeah, and I noticed in looking at your book, The Moral Imagination, you started with several case studies. You start with an example from Ghana, and I noticed that sometimes, and you're telling, it does seem to come down to even like one individual who's part of the involved in the conflict or the threatened conflict, just doing something particularly wise that is a kind of a breakthrough moment. And I found that, I didn't know whether to find that inspiring or depressing. In other words, it's great that there are such people, but it also suggests that there's no magic formula, right? And that to some extent you are putting your hopes on contingency.
Well, yes and no. I think, the four stories that I opened that book with, the background to those is that I was particularly interested in how, in the most unexpected of ways, people and communities that were most affected by violence had a capacity to find a surprising way of engaging with the challenges that they faced. The particular case that you're mentioning was actually embedded in a context of a wider set of community processes, but within which, at a given moment, a person responded differently in a public setting than what was expected to be the response to what had been a form of denigration and humiliation. And in that response, opened up a whole different way that the communities themselves began to engage with each other. And I think it shows us rather consistently that there is no one single formula by which these things happen, that our individual choices do make a difference, that communities that sometimes we feel are the hardest hit and the hardest impacted by violence are also the communities that demonstrate the greatest resilience and capacity for imagination. Their survival, in part, depends on how they respond to the challenges that they have before them. And for me, those things have been deeply inspirational. That doesn't lower my interest in studying, understanding, and developing skillful responses to those, but I'm also very cognizant that coming out of conflict requires creativity, requires building, developing something that brings into existence that which right now does not exist. And that is a kind of, in other words, peace is a constant birthing process. You're bringing forward something that has to disrupt the patterns that have been so powerful around people. And the source of what that might be is not something that's easily controlled by a particular person or group. It often has a certain level of, it's like the creative act. It's something that no one fully expected. And that's what I find time and again, is that we need to develop alongside of our skilled analytical approaches to conflict, the space for what essentially is something more akin to the artistic process. That is the openness to that creativity that is within our reach that we have not always fully embraced.
Okay. So this is what you mean by moral imagination, because that's a term that's been used in different ways by different people. I actually have a particular way I've used it that's different from the way you use it. But you're talking about literally imagining, I guess, a kind of solution that hasn't necessarily transpired before. In other words, there's something, you're having to literally imagine something novel in order to kind of think your way out of the problem.
Yeah. Well, I differentiate in the book, The Moral Imagination. Well, the first thing I note is that the phrase itself dates back a couple of centuries. So it's not something that was originated, certainly not by me, but even in the ethos of the recent decades. And when I began to look fairly systematically, I found in the range of about 20 or 25 books that either had a subtitle or a title that used the phrase the moral imagination, and they cut across a wide set of disciplines. And I was curious, I read through all of them, I was curious to know what is it that seems to cohere around this, and then I compared that to the situations that I was looking at in reference to protracted conflict. And so I actually land on sort of four lenses, so four forms of imagination that describe what I refer to as the moral imagination. And the first one of those is that people that are caught in consistent patterns of deep conflict develop the imagination that they themselves are part of a web of relationships that is inclusive of their enemies. And I refer to this sometimes as what we could call the grandchild imagination. In other words, ultimately, the decisions that I make and that we make, inclusive of our enemies, our grandchildren are linked. Both the well-being of my children and the well-being of their children have something to do with how we choose to respond today. So that first one is imagining yourself in a web of relationship that includes those who you may even fear.
And does that entail thinking of the relationship as somewhat non-zero sum? In other words, imagining that your fortunes are to some extent positively correlated, intertwined.
Yeah, absolutely. And that the choices that you're making mutually affect each other. The second imagination that I saw rather consistently in places, especially where people were able to move beyond the cycles of violence, was it's essentially an imagination about complexity. And within that, what it suggests is that conflict is not about exactly what you said, a kind of a zero-sum binary. It's not either this or that. It is often much more complex. And that leads essentially to a quality around imagination, which is to stay curious, to retain and sustain a curiosity. But that curiosity is both about the other, those who we may fear, but it's also a curiosity about ourselves. Why do we get hooked and react in the ways we do? And it's a curiosity about the situation, the context, and the issues. That ability to sustain curiosity is also an ability to live with a greater deal of patience in the face of ambiguity. And I think one of the keys that we have grown less patient with is we don't want ambiguity anymore. We just want to eliminate that complexity, get rid of it. And so we choose a portion of something that's complex and we lift that forward as the ultimate truth. And as we know, there are a lot of things that are happening simultaneously around situations that entail our lives and our relationships. And building a capacity for patience, curiosity, I think that's the second imagination.
So can I just interrupt? Is there an example of this kind of insisting on an overly simple, unambiguous view of things? I mean, is there an example that comes to mind from a current conflict or a kind of thing that people do in that regard?
Well, so I think the one that most captivated my attention, I mean, obviously we've just come through a really tough election period, and a lot of things got framed as us and them.
Right.
Either you're with this issue or you're opposed to it.
Right.
You're going to do this or that. If you go back a few not long ago to the period of September 11, one of the things that came out of that is the world is divided between us and them. You're either with us or you're against us, was one of the phrases that politically gained a great deal of prominence. The world is far more complex than that. The world of our enemies is far more complex than that. If you portray a world of threat that you see out there, it is not a world that is made up with a simple binary. And I think one of the things that we get ourselves in a lot of trouble with, and one of the things that we have to learn in our current social and political sphere right now, is the ability to sit alongside the fact that we are not monoliths made up of two sides.
Right.
This is just not the reality. Those that voted one way or another have a very complex set of things that may have brought them to those conclusions or those perspectives. And the ability to have curiosity about the story that sits behind how you came to see the world the way you did, the experiences that have been formative for the ways that you view a particular thing, those are the places where we touch our humanity and the richness of who we are. Mm-hmm. And it is, I think, antithetical to the very nature of being a human being that we limit that to a way that you are either this or you are that. We are most commonly both.
And by the way, Syria is, I think, a good example of that kind of complexity. When you look at the interrelationship, I mean, you know, Russia and Turkey have enough things in common that they are now doing business together in a certain sense, even though not so long ago Turkey shot down a Russian plane and it was the mortal enemy. And you know, it's an extremely complicated situation. And in a way, I think what it boils down to is to remember that, you know, game theorists distinguish between zero-sum and non-zero-sum games. But the truth is, in real life, there are very few purely zero-sum relationships. There are very few cases. Your most bitter enemy, if you think about it, you can imagine an outcome that would be worse for both of you than what you've got right now. What that means is it's a non-zero-sum situation. It's not a purely zero-sum situation. Right. No,
that's exactly right. And I think, you know, a lot of the theory behind conflict and the early viewpoints that developed around the functions of conflict, especially from the work of Louis Kozer quite some years ago, was the notion that conflict has a variety of different functions. And one of those is that conflict becomes the most harmful when we push it into an absolute binary that actually healthy societies, healthy relationships, have a cross-cutting effect. So if it was you and me, Bob, if on every single issue we were on opposite sides, we're in a deep trouble. But if we notice that we're both parents and we struggle with what to do with teenagers, if we notice that on the school board thing, I fall on this side, but you want to fall on that one. But on the new public building process, I agree with you that I don't want this road coming through our neighborhood in this way. Mm-hmm. And on the question of what we should do about, you know, the mining that is happening just outside of town, we may fall in other words, where we have cross-cutting ways that we agree, and we learn that we can be together and have disagree. It actually has a binding effect. It has what's referred to as conflict also achieving some coherence among who we are. Is
it possible to kind of cultivate that awareness? Because an example I've always thought of is in the United States, there are probably few groups that are more kind of wary of Muslims than evangelical Christians. Yet if you look at their values, I mean, if you found them discussing what kind of values should be instilled in kids in the public schools, you'd find a tremendous amount of agreement. And,
absolutely.
But that doesn't, you don't see that, I don't see that realized much. Maybe I haven't looked in the right places. And of course there are people now, including politicians, almost devoted to keeping people from seeing that kind of commonality. But I guess my question is that the kind of thing, you've been involved in a lot of these situations around the world, is it possible to cultivate an awareness of the non-zero sum link in a way that really proves transformative?
Absolutely. And some of what you just described, it goes precisely to the point I was trying to make. So if we imagine ourselves on the other sides of what is portrayed as a religious divide that's incompatible, but we put on for a period of time different identity hats. So if we're sitting together and asking the question, what do we hope for in education for our children? What do we hope for in terms of opportunity for teenagers looking for employment? What do we hope for in terms of access to recreation and sports? Sports, for example, is one of the areas that has been explored a lot around conflict zones. That where you can engage in activities where people are coming together for something they both have a passion about. Now our identities are, we're passionate about soccer, right? We're not Muslims and Christians. We're passionate about something. Suddenly you have an arena that permits you to notice how you as human beings have a variety of things that both motivate and identify you and that talk to you in reference to your deeper sense of who you are. That has much to do with creating a wider view where you don't permit a single identity to be the only one that defines who you are in the relationships that you may have. So if it leads to my third and fourth point on this imagination, the third one is precisely this: how in a given setting where it has become really divided, where there's very little communication and contact, what kind of creative activity, what kind of creative imagination can be brought to bear that permits us to re-look at who we are and how we will choose to be together. And that, for me, was the third imagination. Really had a lot to do with the fact that the creative act is always within our potential, that we have the ability to find ways of creating meaning and framing and approaches, many times totally unexpected, that transcend the ways that this has created great difficulty and animosity. And the fourth one, which maybe is the most critical, because a lot of the stories I deal with are in settings where there's a good bit of violence, is that consistently I found that people had an imagination about risk. And for me, risk means that you're entering into something that where you don't fully control the outcome. If you know before you do it that you're going to control what comes out of it, it actually is not a form of risk. What risk really means is that you're stepping into a mystery, into the unknown. And in the context of conflict, that often has to do with two things that are happening simultaneously. It is a risk to reach out to those you fear, and it is a risk to those who are in your own community and the pressure they will put on you if you open relationship with those they fear or those they view as the enemy. And I think this actually requires a form of what I would call social courage. Social courage is both the ability to reach out to people who are on the other side of the divide, but social courage is also the capacity to turn and face within our own tribe, within our own community, within our own group, and say, some of the things we are doing are not the best of who we could be. Mm-hmm. And when you see that happening, especially in the form of dehumanization, it's the courage to rehumanize those situations of conflict, both in terms of the other and in terms of the dignity that we agree to offer to those who are different than us. Mm-hmm. And I think that notion of risk was one of the ones I found rather consistent, because many of the people that I work with, when they take a risk, it isn't just a risk of whether I'll be rejected in this conversation. It actually can be a risk around the question of your life and survival.
Right, so, and I mean, you take a situation like Israel-Palestine, and you see that on both sides. I mean, you see on the one hand groups like, the military veterans, the group called Breaking the Silence, which tries to call attention to kind of crimes committed by Israeli soldiers in the West Bank. Those people are, I don't know if ostracized is too heavy a word, but I mean, they have a hard time getting taken seriously in mainstream Israeli discourse. And on the other side, of course, Palestinians who make certain kinds of overtures will be accused of various things. I mean, is there? It's a very hard thing to deal with when to show courage is in fact to marginalize yourself, if not even to invite, some kind of personal physical risk.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's precisely why I refer to it as imagination. It's imagination about that risk. Typically, the people that I have been close to that do that do not imagine the sort of ultimate outcomes that it may lead to. They're imagining the first small step. What is it that we choose to do today? Right? Mm-hmm. That's more commonly how I've experienced it. Mm-hmm. So if you took, for example, the Bereaved Parents Association in Israel-Palestine, the context you were using, these are parents who have lost family members or children in particular. One of the things that they do, they do a variety of very interesting things. This is Palestinian Israelis. Mm-hmm. Is that where, let's imagine that there is a bombing, or that there is a bus that's blown up, or that there is a mortar shell that landed in a particular location. They go together to the hospital most proximate to that place, and they give blood together. Now, this to me is a highly symbolic act of imagining that I am in relationship with even those who I may fear, that I have the ability to sustain a curiosity about the situation, about the people, about what's happening, that I choose a creative act, in this case, the giving of blood to replace blood that's taken, but to do it together with the people who on both sides have been harmed. Mm-hmm. And to do that as a risk, meaning that there will be people in my community that don't understand me, and there certainly will be people on the other side who don't understand it. But that capacity is what I would call the moral imagination. It's attempting to rise to the rehumanization of a situation that has become totally humiliating and dehumanized. And that is at the core of where I think much of our initiative around peace has to actually be placed.
Of course, there are people who would say, you've just shown us how hopeless it is, because notwithstanding the courage and imagination of these people, things have rarely looked so grim for a two-state solution, at least in the near term, in Israel-Palestine. But you managed to keep your own hope alive, at least. I gather you have seen situations where, you seem to feel sure that these little efforts, even though they exist on the margins of both of these societies, efforts like this, are worth sustaining, and in the long run, those are the kind of the main sources of hope?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because we have no opportunity and no time lost to sustain an ability to understand better who we're going to choose to be as a global and human family. And to me, it can certainly be forwarded by the actions of national polity in large-scale negotiations. In Colombia, for example, it's one of the signs of hope. We now have a half-century war that is coming through a process. It's not easy. There will be a difficult implementation period. But it was a context that has parallel to Israel-Palestine in sitting as one of the longest-standing, most difficult situations. For years, if not decades, communities across Colombia have been engaging in the very things that became significant for what now has to happen as the steps that move forward. And I think our task is not to ask the question, where is the perfect solution that solves this? Our task is to ask the question, how do I respond today with what I have access to that makes a difference in the lives where I am at, and that serves as example of the direction that we are trying to proceed? Mm-hmm. And those are the things that I think we have to do, and that remain the greatest signs of hope. Peace ultimately is about the quality of relationships, not the quantity of policy or the quantity of the weapons that we may have. It has to do with the ways in which we engage directly with the quality of who we're choosing to be with each other. That starts in my local communities. It starts in the local communities in places that are hard. And it starts with the ways in which senators and Congress people relate to each other. It starts in the ways that mayors engage their issues. There is no place outside of which it is not about human beings choosing to respond to situations with imagination and care and compassion. Mm-hmm. So how and where do we mobilize that? Well, I think it mobilizes every place that we can find it. And I will choose consistently to stand alongside and with people who are attempting to do that, knowing that I will also do whatever I can to bring that to a wider scale. But I believe firmly that without a core of reconciled people, there is no possibility that nations reconcile. You have to find them, whether they are in the exemplars of the Nelson Mandelas and the de Klerks, who provide a sort of a national figure of that. Mandela attending a rugby event, symbolic levels, or whether it is at the level of 4 or 5 people going and giving blood together across the divide, saying we no longer will harbor this level of violence in our communities, and we don't have access to change everything, but those things that we can change, we will do so together. That's, for me, the core of this thing.
So it's part of the idea that you kind of never know when some major contingency will unfold that will make prospects look either better or worse. Maybe something so horrific will happen that everybody goes, we got to do something about this. But in a way, to prepare for favorable contingencies in the sense of contingencies that can make peace more likely, you have to be tending the soil all along just to maximize the chances that when something breaks that has favorable potential, it'll break in the right direction. That's the idea?
That's the idea, and that it has greater potential for sustainability. I mean, a lot of what I'm a part of teams of people that are systematically studying national peace agreements over the last 30 years. And we know that peace agreements at about a 50% rate return back to war, right? Those that have greater capacity to sustain themselves are usually more detailed in what they're doing, but they also contemplate a wider range of things that touch on the lives of people that run from national to local levels. There's a capacity to envision this as a whole body politic change, as our good friend Harold Saunders used to say, who worked for many years in the State Department and is engaged, started the Sustained Dialogue Institute, recently passed away. This notion that it is about whole body, whole level initiative, and not exclusively as something that lands as a political solution to a military problem. Those are the least sustainable agreements. The ones that are more sustainable have a wider array of things that they do. They engage in a wider set of policy things, but they also create a wider form of participation. Where those examples already exist, even in the hardest of conditions, you have a much better chance to have the infrastructure necessary to support the change that's needed.
And are there any situations that are just so inflamed that you kind of think, now isn't the time? It's like even preparing the soil is hopeless. And what I'm thinking about is Syria. It's like hard to imagine where you would start. I mean, there are so many places where you're just at physical risk to even be, much less be there and be encouraging anything in particular to happen. Is Syria a case where you just kind of say, well, we'll just have to wait until until we get to a different place? Or are you like right now thinking, well, this is what we could be doing in Syria, or maybe this is what people are doing in Syria? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, Syria is not a place that I have been engaged directly, so I only have, somewhat of a peripheral view of the potential things that may be going on at any given time. So I have to draw parallels from other settings to some degree. And Syria, clearly far and away, is probably the biggest breakdown of our international community's early and more constructive responses, and the national communities within Syria, how they've permitted it to come to the place that it's at, makes it a particularly daunting challenge, as you're suggesting. But having said that, what I think has to be thought about is not the question of, oh, it's too hot and burning too much to do anything. It is that it's burning too hot to do certain things. What other things may be possible? Where and how? And my guess is that a lot of those are happening somewhat at the peripheries. In other words, you're working within particular geographies and communities, and you're asking questions: what set of people and conversations, what responses are needed? How might the responses needed to a humanitarian crisis be done in a way that they contribute to rebuilding potential for relationships that have capacity to think about new and different ways to approach the wider macro challenges that are in place? This will, a context of the complexity of Syria will require the complexity of response, meaning that there will be more than one place in which response is needed and creativity is needed. When we were, for example, just to go to a different context, Northern Ireland, over the decades, you would have things that would begin to show some promise at the political level, and then a new round of shootings, assassinations, or bombings would take place where it would cycle back down into deep, deep division, animosity, and violence. Now, within that context, people that were engaged in, say, cross-community work would intentionally begin to ask questions of how do we continue to work on what we're doing, knowing that in the next 5 years there'll probably be 3 or 4 times where we can't do certain things. What else might we have in place to know that when those periods come, we still have these things to go to? And, I had some connection, for example, to ways in which across the paramilitary groups, there were ways in which they began to coordinate, even when they couldn't visibly be seen to do it publicly. They had mechanisms that could be created that would mitigate the level of how far it would cycle, right? Now, personally, I think a lot of that kind of work was a part of why the Good Friday Agreement was able to overcome some of the obstacles it faced when violence reemerged that in earlier decades would have kicked it back into absolute devastating tit-for-tat kind of violence that tended to be the pattern that was in place. So you're not asking a question of whether you have to wait until things are no longer burning. You're asking the question, what kinds of things are possible given the circumstances we're in? And even if they're small, how are they building blocks for what we're trying to get to? That's a different way of framing how you come at that level of complexity, precisely into that imagination about curiosity. Your curiosity about what's possible to cultivate even in the worst of conditions.
Mm-hmm. So Northern Ireland is an interesting example because it was, on the one hand, I guess nominally a religious conflict, at least in the sense that it was Protestants versus Catholics. On the other hand, it's not really thought of that way. I mean, it's like I've never heard anybody say that this was really over the question of whether you get salvation through, faith or works or anything, right? It was not a big kind of theological argument. I think people recognize that it was, these two groups occupied different kind of socioeconomic niches, had different issues, different kinds of access to power, different grievances, different ethnic identities. Now, in other situations with, say, jihadist violence, people are more inclined to think of it as religious, and it's certainly true that it's more common in some of these cases that a religious rationale is put out for the violence. But how do you think, in those situations, do you think of religion per se, religious belief, as the motivating thing, or a prominently motivating thing, or do you even think about kind of the causes of these things as opposed to the solutions?
Well, certainly the religious imaginaries can come to be highly mobilizing.
By religious imaginaries, you mean the people who are going to be helpful?
Well, it can be. I think, as my good colleague Scott Appleby, in the title of his book, talked about, it's the ambivalence of the sacred. That the sacred can be drawn upon to justify violence and defending ourselves against the adversary or the enemy other, and the same sacred backgrounds can be drawn upon to mobilize around reconciliation, nonviolence, other responses to conflicts. So religion per se often contains both possibilities. What I'm referring to is how the religious imaginaries are brought to a particular conflict. So in Northern Ireland, I agree with you, it was not a theological debate, although those identities and the ways that they drew from certain kinds of sources could often reinforce a religious component that were a part of it. The jihadist and more extremist responses that come back counter to the Islamic threat, these are often framed in ways in which people portray them that justify how it is that what you're facing is something that is, the religious threat to our elimination, and how you mobilize someone to become a part of that, which I think is often forms by which religion is manipulated to the service of certain ways of dealing with socioeconomic and political power, certainly. And so it's a very complex equation. I do think there is a lot to be said for taking religion much more seriously in reference to how significant it is in the ways people make sense of their worlds and how they're approaching what it is that justifies the actions and the ways of interpreting what's happening around them. And this has been, in the secular political world, it's been a deficiency. Religion viewed primarily as a kind of it's the non-rational. So let's push it to the margin so that we can deal with more rational processes. In reality, conflict is always about the ways people make sense of the world. And to get into that, you have to come much more into their ways of constructing a worldview and the things that they draw from, that they associate things with, in order to justify both interpretation and action, and that ultimately become to be very much the lens, like my glasses, the perceptions through which they see what is happening around them and how they see themselves and others. And in those contexts where religion is significant, I think we have to have a much greater capacity to sit alongside of how it is that people are making sense of this, and to try to find ways to draw the very best of those traditions to the fore, and to find ways to mitigate parts of our traditions, and we all have them, that lead us into deeply, at least in my view, flawed ways of seeing the complexity of the situations in the human community that we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, this kind of leads to actually the way I had used the term moral imagination, and I started doing it before I was aware of your book, maybe even before your book existed. When was it published, 2005? Or
2005, yeah.
Okay. I don't know. Yeah.
2001, September 11 was when I first started.
Okay.
The framework, yeah.
So the way I had used the term, it's very much relevant to what you just said, and my question isn't about how to use the term, it's more about how important you think this is. You know, there's a distinction that can be made between two kinds of empathy. Like there's the traditional kind, emotional empathy, where you feel people's pain. There's what psychologists sometimes call cognitive empathy, mm-hmm. which is just putting yourself in people's shoes, just understanding the way they're perceiving the world and thinking things through, regardless of whether you have any personal sympathy for them. So you can do this with Vladimir Putin, even if you consider him your enemy. You can do it with some young Muslim who may be on the verge of signing on to jihadism, regardless of how you feel about the person. And I've tried to make the case that actually this kind of just sheer perspective taking is greatly undervalued and possibly more important than the other kind of empathy. In fact, my friend Paul Bloom just published a book called Against Empathy, by which he just means sometimes emotional empathy actually gets in the way of solutions. Mm-hmm. But my claim has been that this kind of perspective-taking thing I think it should be exercised in all possible cases, and there are reasons that we often find it hard to do with our enemies or with people we consider our enemies. We just find it hard to do clearly, and I'm wondering what your take is, based on your experience, on how important you think that is, how hard it is to do, and so on.
Yeah, no, I think I would concur with a good bit of what you've just described. I'll give it to you in shorthand in a way that I tend to interact with, in particular, university students around this. I've been suggesting that in our current context here, so one thing is to place out there, how do I empathize, whether cognitively or emotionally, with Putin? That's a very distant thing. The question we really face is, what do I do with the person sitting next to me in the pew who I disagree with? Mm-hmm. What do I do with the fact that my town voted two different directions over something that now we don't even want to see each other? You know, what are we going to do with this? And I think a lot of this comes back to ask the question, how will the rising generations of this country choose to engage with difference that they actually cohabit? You know, we cohabit spaces where there is enormous difference. So I place it more in the context of the daily and the local. So my suggestion is basically this, that you can create three things with then a final provocation that I add to it. The three things are: develop more of a discipline to listen to understand, rather than a discipline to listen to find the nuggets that you can show are wrong or to defend. And I think this very simple shift from listening to defend to listening to understand places you more along the life story of people. In other words, you're kind of coming into a way of saying, what's it like to have grown up in this particular view? How did the person arrive at this view, right? That kind of a notion. The second is that when you speak, I think I come back to my word courage, which has at its Latin root core or heart. Speak from the heart, which requires a certain level of honesty and vulnerability. And I think one of the things we're often missing is that we wait until we've been angered to explode, and then we don't actually speak from the heart. We speak from somewhere that's about an emotional rush. Or we're too nervous to say anything that somebody might disagree with, so we don't say it very honestly. Mm-hmm. We kind of back away from who we really are. And I think what people want is authenticity. I think I can live a lot more with somebody that's authentic that I disagree with than somebody that I perceive to be inauthentic, in one form or another, whether that's by way of projection or hiding. So when you speak from the heart, speak honestly, authentically, with a certain level of vulnerability, right? The third one is work in the direction of sustaining a relationship with this person so that it's not a kind of a one-time event. In other words, rehumanize your relationship. Now, for me, the provocation is pick somebody, one person, with whom you disagree. You know that you have differences. Choose to go to coffee once a month for the rest of your life.
And do you talk about the thing you disagree about?
Yes. So this is when I say coffee once a month for the rest of your life, you don't have to always talk about the things you disagree about. You may end up talking about, what's happening in like I said, the local school, what's happening with my family, the decision I'm trying to make about where I'm going for vacation. In other words, when it is a commitment to a longer term thing, it no longer is an event that becomes a debate. It is a relationship within which we have a much wider variety of conversations, and where the possibility of envisioning each other in a rehumanized way eliminates some of the volatility, but permits a deeper level of exactly what you were saying, the coming alongside of how it is that someone else sees it, without that being a threat that I need to change my mind or that I need to defend something. And this is what I think is the problem that we have. We have lost the art of basic conversation, the ability to be in a conversation where we can, with dignity and respect, be alongside each other, even if we're deeply different. And I think that's the basis, the starting point that we have to find some way of recuperating.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I know it's 10 a.m. where you are, and I know you have an appointment at 10 a.m., but I want to thank you for taking the time. Again, the name is John Paul Lederach, and your books include The Moral Imagination and Reconcile, Conflict Transformation for Ordinary Christians, and I'm sure for the rest of the world as well. I'm sure there are lessons to be had for everyone. Thank you so much. I'm sure, depending on the particular religious beliefs of our viewers and listeners, they can see you as either literally or figuratively doing God's work. And thank you so much for that, and keep it up.
I appreciate it, Bob. Thank you.
Okay, take care.